Well, I've used the title Epidemiology Counts, which is a deliberate slight pun because, of course, one of the jobs of epidemiology is indeed to count the cases of illness in a population. But epidemiology also sets the framework for understanding the etiology of disease and the outcome of disease and illness. Now, I did get a letter yesterday saying that I had no rights at all to be talking about epidemiology because I knew nothing about it, which may or may not be true, but unfortunately I do have to declare I do have my master's and doctorate in it, so that's just going to have to do for the moment. Well, the same person did also say that as a psychiatrist I wasn't a doctor as well, so perhaps shouldn't listen too closely. So, epidemiology counts. Now, as Peter's already said, it's extremely important before we count we have to know what we're counting. And we have to therefore have a definition of the thing that is out there, whatever it may be, because without a definition that we can agree on, we cannot get even to square one of doing any form of research or any form of analysis. So to have a definition, even a flawed one, is still better than no definition at all. Now, Peter's mentioned there are various case definitions. I must admit, I didn't know the Brighton definition. That's a new one on me, but there we go. And there are probably others. And one way, of course, is the way Peter has approached it, but I thought I'd take a more Darwinian approach and just to see which of these various definitions has actually got the most of the kind of scientific credibility over the years, which really means which is the one that most doctors and researchers are using. Now, of course, it began in 1988 with the very first definition, the CDC definition, which was put together by a large group of immunologists and virologists. There were no psychiatrists in the room, or no British doctors either, both of which were probably in error. But that was how we started. So if we look at it from there, you can see one way of doing it, just simply looking at the total number of citations in the scientific literature. And the 1994 case definition clearly seems to be winning on the fact that it's been cited over 1,000 times, as indeed has the first one. Peter's mentioned the very last one, the Canadian definition, as that wasn't published in a peer-reviewed journal. It leaves no trace in the literature, but the best estimate of how much it's been used is through Google. So it's not really in itself going to be very credible unless and until it's published in one of the many peer-reviewed journals. Total citations, it might be slightly unfair because, of course, some have had more chance to be cited than others. So if we then look at the citation count per year, you can see, again, however, the Fukuda criteria, the 94 ones, seem to still be far and away the most popular. And finally, let's have a look at which ones have stayed the test of time. And again, you can see whereas the Oxford criteria and the Holmes criteria are now losing out very much and are not being cited very much, the 1994 still is. So on a sheer Darwinian level, what other doctors, researchers and scientists are using appears to be the 94 criteria for better or ill, and therefore that's where most of the literature is about. Okay, so assuming that's the criteria we're going to look at, how common is it, whatever it may be? And for the moment, we'll say the it is whatever those criteria devise. We, in fact, did the first large-scale epidemiological study, really, of this condition in UK primary care. And the great beauty of UK primary care, it's a very permeable filter, and estimates from UK primary care are usually very close to true population estimates. And what you can see is, well, two things. What you can see is we are certainly not dealing with something that is particularly uncommon. Okay, it's not a rare condition. We have the overall prevalence figures, and you can see using that CDC criteria, it's around 2% of the population if you look at the confidence limits. Now, many of those also had what we call comorbid psychological disorders, chiefly depression and anxiety. And indeed, very few of those thought that they had chronic fatigue syndrome or ME. So if we then look on the right-hand column, we then can see again the prevalence has obviously gone down, but now we're looking at a pure chronic fatigue syndrome without associated other disorders, and we see an estimate of somewhere, I've noticed that my confidence limits don't include the actual number there, so I better change that slide quickly. I've never noticed it, I haven't looked at this about 10 years. It must have been on that slide for 10 years, and no one has ever noticed it before. It's got an impossible confidence limit. Oh well. Anyway, there you go. But it's around 0.4, 0.5% of British primary care population would fulfil that criteria. So again, still a substantial health problem. And in fact, those are the kind of figures that the more later studies tend to come up with. Here you can see this is Lenny Jason's study, the Chicago study, a nice, large, well-conducted American true population study And in the US, because their primary care isn't a permeable filter, you have to rely on population studies. Coming up with a 0.4%, again, very similar, reporting a female excess and reporting commoner in ethnic minorities, which we'll come back to. And Peter's mentioned the well-funded, of course, as most American things are, damn it, population study out of Georgia, another second CD study. This, in fact, is finding a much higher prevalence, 2.5%, but many of those also will be accounted for by comorbid psychological disorders. Again, a female excess, but still a common thing. So if we look at in many respects, the most boring part of epidemiology, which is the simple counting business, we can say that somewhere between maybe 0.4 up to 2% of primary care populations fulfill criteria. Excluding comorbid psych conditions, this drops down to 0.1 has been the lowest estimate, 0.6 is the highest. What all these studies show, however, is that most people in these kind of studies don't use a term like CFS or chronic or ME to describe their condition. They use many other labels, and CFS and ME are not the only ones out there. But what all these studies also show, again, we showed, first of all, over a decade ago, is even in primary care, the public impact is very considerable. Many are severely disabled, and again, a lot of them do have associated comorbidity. So epidemiology counts, so that there is no contradiction. But Peter's already highlighted the problems of these definitions. These definitions are arbitrary. They did indeed arise from non-smoke-filled rooms. I was in a couple of them. I haven't been in the others. And that's how things work, and we would like them to be based on, more profound epidemiological investigations, but these often take a long time. And in fact, very few labels and diagnoses in health have come around that way. Most have come in this kind of process. And finally, we think that we're dealing already with the problem is putting a line, which of course we have to do in order to do studies. We have to have a definition. In order to give numbers and to run a healthcare system, we have to know the numbers we're dealing with. We have to differentiate between sick people, well people. Doctors have to deal with cases. They have to, in America, they have to bill for cases. But all of this may be somewhat arbitrary, and putting a line in the sand where it's possible there is no line. Now, this is simply looking at the distribution of fatigue. This is purely fatigue in the population. This was about 30,000 people, a study we did some years ago. And on the left, we have people who turn out not to have any fatigue at all. They tend to be deans of medical schools and things like that. So they're very unusual people. In the middle is you or I, and then right on the end are the people we're going to be seeing in the clinic. So we're going to have multiple symptoms, so they're at the very high extreme of the fatigue score, and the one thing we've learned through the years is that isn't the only thing they have. They tend to have many more symptoms, as I'll show you. They have more disability. So there, of course, we're going to get our clinical population, but what you can see is this idea of the lack of a simple divide that tells us and divides the world between the sick and the non-sick. There isn't really such a point. And it's probable that people move along this according to various issues and circumstances. Sometimes they might be here, but what about these people here? Are these sick? Are these well? Well, these people are clearly well. We could have an argument about what deans of medical schools are. But you can see the whole point I'm making is that there isn't a single cut-off. But that in itself may actually be, Peter thinks that that's just a reflection of the problems of definition, but it might be that is how the world actually is. Because if this was a chart of blood pressure, you would have no problem at all with it. We know that blood pressure is dimensionally distributed. There isn't a disease called high blood pressure, but of course, if this was blood pressure and you get at the end here, you're going to have all sorts of problems and this will kill you. So this is clearly a pathological entity, but there's no absolute simple cut-off between low, medium and high blood pressure. So maybe that is actually how the world is organised. And if we look at these symptoms, here's the original one from the immunologists and virologists in 1988 when they thought this was a chronic Epstein-Barr virus. That was the word for it then, chronic mononucleosis. So there were more of immunological and virological symptoms. As the research tended not to confirm that, some of those were dropped. But again, these symptoms too are somewhat arbitrary. Much to my shock, Peter's nicked this slide, so you've already seen one version of it before. And let's see it again. You can see there's no conspiracy going on here, because if there was, we might have possibly talked about what we're all going to say. No, we didn't. But the point is, now these are the symptoms here that come under the definition of chronic fatigue syndrome. These are the ones, the 894 CDC symptoms. Now, these are all the other symptoms that they didn't use. So those are the symptoms that they said, or we said, because I was there. I can't remember you there. Sharpie, were you there, Peter? I can't remember. Okay. I remember the food was terrible. I do remember that anyway. But, and those are the ones that the great and the good said were not part of CFS. But you can see that this is from our population-based study, that actually all that's happening is the more you have of the one here, the more you have of the one there. And that seems to me quite strongly suggestive there's an arbitrary nature still to the way we've selected symptoms, and more importantly is the number of symptoms. Now, as you go, and we could perhaps have put along that graph symptoms of, the Rome criteria for irritable bowel or whatever, and we would still have, and then those CFS symptoms would have slipped onto the y-axis, but the relationship would not have changed. And the other thing that doesn't change, and again, this is the slide you have seen from Peter, is that, again, it doesn't mean that as you move up this scale, because obviously once you're here with 9 CFS symptoms, you're going to fulfill the criteria. Does that mean there you've got the real McCoy and the kind of comorbid psychological symptoms disappear? No, not at all. It goes the other way around. You're even more likely to be scoring, and this is a direct clinical interview now, the gold standard for psychiatric disorders on here as well. Because psychological symptoms are actually no different either. They're just as arbitrary. They don't, they're just the same as the others. The world is not divided into a nice simple division between these symptoms and those symptoms. That isn't how it works. And again, this is the same now from our study, back now to a true population sample, just repeating the same thing. There's fatigue getting more severe. There's GHQ as a simple scoring of psychological health. There are too many studies like this now to even bother going over. It is axiomatic from epidemiology that the greater the number of symptoms you have, the more likely you are, not the less likely you are, to score on this, on psychological disorder, the greater your disability and the greater your chances of fulfilling criteria for all these other syndromes that Peter has mentioned. So then, the more symptoms we include in a case definition, the greater, not the less, association with psychological morbidity. And similarly, the more evidence of disability that we require in our case definition, the greater the association as well. And the current criteria require 50% functional impairment. That is already selecting for a population more at risk. Okay, what then finally can Epi tell us about risk factors and etiology? Because that's the other, and to my mind, the reason why I still really enjoy epidemiology, and I still think it's the kind of mother of the kind of sciences of clinical medicine in all of its disciplines, because it gives you the framework of understanding disease. Now, there have been many things that have been proposed over the years, as we heard. These are some of the various theories that have been around, and there are probably many others which one could update. But there's a whole lot of potential villains out there, any of which, or all of which, or none of which, could be responsible for chronic fatigue syndrome. But before we get onto it, it's time to be a bit of a spoilsport. Matt and I wrote a paper 10 years ago. This was nothing to do with chronic fatigue syndrome. It was a paper that got tremendous publicity because it said that the more sex you had, the longer you lived. And obviously this was the kind of good news that people had been looking for many years. But we wrote a commentary on it, and we did point out how, and this just shows you what spoilsports we are, that in fact this paper could probably be explained by other factors. And the problems of bias, confounding, reverse causality and chance were much more likely to be explanations that this was a true finding out there. And that is true, really, of all the things that we're talking about. And one of the things I believe, and I believe with my heart of heart, that distinguishes kind of good science, good clinical academics from others, is the first thing a good scientist or academic does is to try and find out why they've got it wrong, and to look at these particular issues first and foremost. Take, for example, the issue of selection bias. Now, if I'd given this talk 20 years ago, in fact I probably did, but if I had, at that time, these are all now, you don't see these kind of headlines anymore, doctors link yuppie flu. But back then, 20 years ago, just shortly after the very first newspaper articles started to appear in the UK press, that was the sobriquet for this illness. And it seemed to have a certain relevance, because the truth was, if you went into the clinic, that is the kind of person that you saw. Even in Camberwell, where we worked, which is not and I'll tell you, it's not an affluent, probably most of you have never been there, to be honest, but if you had, it's not a particularly affluent part of London, we still saw mainly people in the healthcare professions, teaching professions, and so on. We hardly ever saw anyone, and we still don't, from the ethnic minorities. And people did create very elaborate explanations for why this might be, some of which really, frankly, bordered on the racist, but nevertheless, to explain why should this new illness, or not so new illness, particularly affect this group of people. Well, the answer was, of course, it didn't. And starting with our study, we showed very clearly that you were much more likely to have chronic fatigue syndrome if you came from a lower social class, not a higher social class. That has been replicated time and time again. Only the Georgia study, I don't quite know why that didn't show it. They have not have classes in Georgia, or I don't know. Anyway, that didn't show it. But all the others have. And what we're seeing is a selection bias. So people in higher social classes are more likely to use the label of something like ME. They're much more likely to work their way through the healthcare system and get to the specialist clinic than people in lower social classes. But it is a bias. It tells you nothing whatsoever about etiology. For etiology, you have to understand why is it commoner in lower social classes and why is it in fact commoner in ethnic minorities, which it is, as opposed to ethnic majorities such as that. Now, what about confounding? Tony's mentioned confounding, but he didn't actually explain what it was, so I thought it might be an idea just to remind you what confounding is and why it's crucially important. And the study that I use to teach on this is a study of the Samaritans and the impact of the Samaritans. Nothing to do with chronic fatigue syndrome, but it's an elegant description of confounding. There was a study done that looked at the impact of the Samaritans on the suicide rate. And what they did was they showed from, this is quite an old study because the Samaritans have been around for some time now, but they showed in various towns in Britain when they opened their Samaritans branch what then happened to the suicide rate in the following years. And you can see that what has happened has been a dramatic decrease in suicide after a Samaritans branch opened in these various towns and cities across England and Wales. Well, that's great. However, what they also studied was all those cities, and there were quite a lot then, that didn't have a Samaritans branch. And you can see the suicide rate, exactly the same thing has happened. Psychiatrists can't apply for this next question, but those are not psychiatrists. Why? What's the confounder? What's the explanation, the alternative explanation for something that happened about the same time as the Samaritans came to prominence and also had a dramatic effect on the suicide rate? Rona, you're not a psychiatrist, and you're not British, actually, so you won't know, will you? No, okay. Well, okay, the answer is it's the switch from coal to natural gas. Okay? And that happened at the same time, and it had a massive impact, but you might falsely conclude that it was the reason why the Samaritans were successful. I'm sure they do an excellent job, but they weren't responsible for that drop in the suicide rate. That's what a confounder is. It's an alternative explanation for something that you've observed. And it's axiomatic, again, in science. Now, that's what you start looking for. When you find something, think about what are the alternative explanations. And it works right across the board. Now, again, you can see how useless we all are, because you've already... Oh, no, you haven't seen this. This was the original neuroendocrinological study showing low cortisol in CFS. This is what you have seen. This is Tony's study showing the same thing. Well, that's fair enough. And in fact, what Tony didn't say, this is probably the most replicated biological abnormality across the board. There was a further massive replication in the archives just a few weeks ago. So this is one of the few things that we keep finding. So clearly then, this is interesting and relevant. Now, another thing that we keep finding, this is one of our studies. We do other things, amazingly enough. This is an immunological study from King's. But we found also evidence of immune activation. So here's it in Immunology Journal. And again, this has been found many times. But the issue about a confounding is this. When you have low cortisol, then what actually happens is that itself can lead to, or does lead to, a mild immune activation. The same way when you give cortisol, or hydrocortisone, or steroids, they're immunosuppressant. Low cortisol is immune activating. So it could be one of the explanations that we considered, and we still don't know if it's right or wrong, but one of the explanations could be that that is confounded by low cortisol. So that's what I mean. Confounding happens across science. You always have to think about it. Is there something else that could be associated with chronic fatigue syndrome? Low cortisol, definitely. And could be the cause of a mild immune activation. That could be, might not be, but could be low cortisol. So bias then is evil. Bias is wicked because bias tells you the wrong answers. How do you avoid it? Well, there are two things you should do. One is, The further, the more you are in specialist care, the greater the risks of bias. Remember those false assumptions that we were dealing with yuppie flu. And second, studies in which you measure the exposure or risk factor, or whatever you're going to call it, before you measure the outcome, which now is going to be chronic fatigue syndrome in the world that we're going to talk about today, but this applies across the board, it doesn't matter what it is, where you have the exposure measured first, this will always be a more powerful design than the alternative where you measure the two together and try and look back in time as to what had happened. Studies in our hospital, study of chronic fatigue syndrome, in which we try and guess what viral infections people had 3, 5, 6, 10 years ago, are likely to be inherently flawed and very unlikely to provide you with valid answers, whereas studies where you do the opposite, I'll show a couple of those, where you take people with viral infections and follow them up, are always going to be a more powerful design. Oh, God. Right, well, this is a very postmodern talk, so now you all have to think about a picture of Jeremy Paxman. And that's the reason I did that, is because Paxman sometimes says, when he's interviewing, he always has politicians, he has a little sign in front of him saying, "Why is this lying bastard lying to me?" It's a kind of mental image he has. But it's the same when you read a scientific paper, you have to think, why am I getting this data? What are the alternative explanations? Why is my data trying to mislead me? And that's one of the things you must do. So there we are. Sorry about that. So what about prospective? I'm going to end now with just looking at prospective studies in which that kind of bias is not present. Now, let's take the bull by the horns. There are now too many studies that, although Tony showed my original study, which has been much cited and replicated, there is an association between chronic fatigue syndrome and psychiatric disorders. That is not in any way surprising, because if you look at the criteria that we use to diagnose depression and the criteria we use to diagnose chronic fatigue syndrome, about half of them overlap. That's because they're both arbitrary definitions. Okay, definition was whatever the APA say this year, and DSM, that's depression. We have CFS, and half of the things in those definitions are the same. So they're already laying claim to some of the same clinical territory. And cross-sectional study after cross-sectional study finds that association, but that's all it is, an association. It doesn't tell you what is the direction. Is this a consequence? Physical illness? Could that be causing psychiatric disorder? And of course, again, millions of studies show that's the case. If you have any chronic physical illness, you have a doubling or trebling of the rate of psych disorder. Is it the psych disorder makes you more vulnerable? So it's a risk factor, or is it a confounder? There's some third thing, maybe something going on in the brain that gives you both psych disorder and also CFS. We can eliminate the first one fairly reasonably. It's certainly the case that in some, it will be the case that having CFS is the cause of psych disorder. But if we look at overall, and nobody does these studies anymore because they're so clear-cut in their results, where we compare the rates of psych disorder against those in various different chronic physical illnesses. There's, I think, 7 or 8 of these studies. I've forgotten to put a couple of new ones on. What you can see on the last column, the relative risk, you're always getting double the rate in the CFS. Now, the absolute rates rather differ. That's because the criteria used for psych disorder differ, but they don't differ within each study. So the relative risk is the key thing to look at, and you can see then there is clearly a considerable excess. So that simple explanation, it's a response to physical illness, will be true in some, but it won't explain these results overall. Oh, risk factor then or confounder. Well, one of the ways of doing this, and there are various, but I'm going to just concentrate really briefly on one longitudinal study because it's probably one of the most powerful things that we have in this country, and these are the birth cohorts. And Matthew Hotoff has made great use of these for various series of studies, but also in this area. This is a sample of everyone that was born on a particular week, in 1 week in March 1946. And it's interesting, you can already see 1946 how the world has changed, because one of the interesting things about this code, you relaxed by the way, I'm not going to talk about chronic fatigue for a little bit, was that they felt then that they couldn't study the illegitimate births. Okay, so they were recorded obviously, but they didn't think it was quite right or proper to study all those women back then, as the GIs and everything were around. So it's just illegitimate births. Okay, Britain of course is a very different country then. Just a couple of things just to remind you, and again, because just to kind of break this up a little bit. How many, in those days then, 1946, what proportion of British households had refrigerators? Who would like to guess? Robin. There you are, you caught my eye, that was a mistake, wasn't it? Have a guess. Well, no, actually, no. It's actually 2%. It was 2%. Okay. All right. What percentage had washing machines? Who wants to have a guess on that? Proportion of washing machines. Very good. 4%. 4%. Okay. What about vacuum cleaners? What proportion had vacuum cleaners in 1946? Go on. Going up 20%. It's actually 40%. They were quite common. Okay. What proportion had indoor toilet facilities? It was actually 50. It was about half. Half didn't. So Britain was a different country then, and I'm absolutely fascinated by how these things have changed over the years, and I absolutely love it. But anyway, let's get on. Let's go back to the real McCoy, shall we? Let's see what that tells us about the relationship. Now, Matthew, I think, is going to talk about this, and as we share an office, we do at least talk to each other occasionally. So all I'm going to say is tremendous measures of sight disorder in the 46 cohort, going right back to the earliest years, repeated over time, and if you look at that, what you find is up to the age of 36, before developing CFS, then you find this ratio of about 2 to 3 times. So people who had it before were then 2 to 3 times more likely, when finally followed up in the last sweep, to then have developed CFS. So clearly, in the 46 cohort, it is definitely a risk factor. But it isn't the only one as well. Now let's look at a different thing, which is the relationship between CFS and exercise. Now, we know from clinical work, many patients report that they were previously very active. We see a lot of sportsmen in the clinic, and others say, you know, when I got a virus, I continued to be active, and that's one of the reasons that I think I got ill. I didn't rest enough early in the illness. On the other hand, we also have a very good literature showing, of course, chronic illness, bed rest can cause physical deconditioning and fatigue itself. We have the success of graded exercise therapy, which we'll hear about. And finally, we have another Matthew study showing right back in childhood lower levels of activity were associated in another cohort, happening some years later, the 1970 cohort, with chronic fatigue syndrome. So every reason to look at exercise, but a rather conflicting pattern of different reports. But when Matt and Sam Harvey, doing a PhD with us, looked at this in the 46 cohort, there was a very definite finding. Exercise measured at any of these times before the onset of chronic fatigue syndrome was associated with CFS. And these were people who these are more exercise. So at every time when it was recorded, those who would go on to develop CFS were more active at each and every time point. Likewise, those who still persisting in sports at the age of 43, clearly a dangerous thing to do, they can see that was a massively important risk factor. They were 10 times more likely to go on to CFS, which is slightly worrying, as I still do a bit myself, but clearly shouldn't. But again, remember the power of the design. Shut up, I heard that. Okay. Remember the power of the design. This was recorded before. It's not influenced by subsequent judgments. Sometimes people tell us about their personalities because they're very anxious to avoid any stigma of psychiatric disorder, and often people are biased in their own assessments. We all are. We all are not always the best judges of we've been. But this is prospective, and you can't have that bias in this kind of study. And then the final set of prospective studies we have, well, the idea of post-infectious fatigue is nothing new. It goes right back to the beginnings of our understanding of infective agents in the modern era, and really, as various new agents are discovered, it's very quick that they are reported to be associated with a post-infectious fatigue syndrome. Far and away the best evidence, however, for this comes from Peter White's cohort study, which is pretty definitive and shows very clearly that glandular fever, EBV, Epstein-Barr virus, is clearly associated and has a specific association with chronic fatigue syndrome. Again, even in a prospective study, never believe one, but it's been replicated now 3 or 4 times. So EBV does seem to do this. But is this a general thing? Is it just, just a non-specific response, or is it more specific? Well, we then, about the same time as Peter was doing his study, we did a cohort study in the community looking at common viral infections, of which very few were EBV. And again, the power of the study was twofold. One is we're in primary care, so we took 1,200 people turning up with the GP who had mainly the flu and things like that, and we took the next person in the clinic who didn't. But before they'd done that, we'd already surveyed the entire community, 6 general practices, and got a measure of prior fatigue and prior psychological distress. And that study went very well, because the first practice I chose, I then went and married the partner, and so that worked well. But of course, we then had to extend to 5 other practices, and that's not a way you can keep recruiting GPs. But anyway, and we're going to follow up. The other thing to notice, the incredibly high follow-up rates we got then. You can see these are around 90% follow-up rates. The study's old. We published it in 95, and people were just more compliant then, and life has changed to anyone in epidemiology. What do we find? Well, simple thing, ever so straightforward. You can see very clearly, it doesn't matter what definition we use. As we go down the definitions, there's no association, there was no likelihood for those who'd had common viral infections to be more likely to develop chronic fatigue. If anything, as we went down, it seemed almost as if getting a virus was protective against developing post-viral fatigue, because you can see those odds ratios are going down. There's an artifactual reason for that. But what we did show, in contrast, was those measures of prior psych disorder, or indeed if the GP had ever in the notes put in a psych diagnosis, was a strong association with developing CFS. So we can see now convergent validity coming on. Prior disorder is increasing the risk of developing things, developing the illness. So, to conclude, and this really is a conclusion, there are numerous studies of risk factors, but this has nothing to do with us. This is a paper coming out shortly in PsycMed, and what they've done is a meta-analysis of risk factor studies, only looking at those studies that have the kind of design that I've just described to you, which allow you to determine cause and effect. And these then, at the moment, tend to be the more confirmed risk factors. So even then, some of these, like here, ingestion of raw milk, is based on one small study with a good design, but it's not been replicated. But some of these others, gender, social class, early childhood illness, as you heard from Tony, again, there's a strange one. They report no sport in spare time. They're not aware of the 46 cohort studies, which report exactly the opposite. So even when you have good designs, you do sometimes still get conflicting ends. For infections, EBV clearly, beautifully shown by Peter. Also Q fever and a strange Ross River virus, viral meningitis shown. Most others have not been shown prospectively to be associated. But it's also other things as well. This might be a marker for behavior or might be a marker for severity. And finally, psychological disorders. Emotional instability comes from that enormous Swedish twin study, which is a very powerful design, childhood trauma, previous disorders. These are important then, because what we're saying is that any proposed model for CFS, if it's going to reflect the world as it is, must explain these epidemiological findings. It must explain the genetics findings, it must explain the gender bias, it must explain these links with previous psychological disorders, it must explain why some but not all agents can initiate CFS, and it must explain these complicated links with activity. It's not possible really, though, to completely avoid the outside world, much as though we would like. And this kind of demonstration squeezed the psychs out of ME, and one can understand the emotions behind this, but I do find it hard to sympathize. And I also think it's a great mistake. Because if you really actually want to understand chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, whatever we're going to call it, you have to do so in possession of all the facts. Not just those facts that you like, but all of them. You can't pick and choose. And the history of science tells us very clearly that turning your back on things that you don't like, things that aren't going the way you would want them to, and there are many, many examples of this, at best leads to false conclusions and bad decisions, and at worst leads to bigotry and intolerance. It is not good enough to dismiss the research that we have described as nonsense, or those who followed it as knaves, charlatans, or varlets, because they're none of those things. If you want to help sufferers, you have to see the world as it is, in all its complexity, and not just parts of it. That's short to be my last slide, but I don't really want to leave it like that because I don't like it. So this actually now is my last slide. And this is just finally a kind of personal note. A strange thing has happened. I still see patients every week, but I've really pulled out of research in this area and I have very little involvement now. And I've done the exact opposite of Sir Peter Spence there at the back. He's moved from the armed forces into the world of chronic fatigue syndrome at about the same time as I've done exactly the opposite. I haven't joined the armed forces, by the way, so those interested in the security of the country can be relaxed on that one. But I have now devoted nearly all of my time towards research in this area. And if Sir Peter, if things are going as well for you as they are for me in this area, then you're a very happy man, because I certainly am as well. At that point, thank you very much.